What if a powerful billionaire met two abandoned little girls and chose to stay instead of walk away? Daniel Carter didn't believe in interruptions. His life ran on precision, each hour accounted for, each decision weighed against a return on investment. He had built his empire on logic, not emotion, and the world had rewarded him handsomely. Penthouse views, boardroom power, press conferences with polite applause. It was a life where every moment had a price and every interaction had a purpose. So that Thursday afternoon, when he stepped out of his black car and strode toward the main entrance of Riverside Medical Center, he wasn't looking to be moved. He wasn't there to feel anything. Just another deal to close this time. A strategic partnership that would increase his company's pharmaceutical reach by another 12%. Clean, calculated, controlled. But as he climbed the hospital steps, something caught his eye, a shape small and still, huddled near the stone wall by the entrance. At first, Daniel ignored it. He had become good at looking past things that didn't concern him. But his eyes drifted back, and this time, he saw her. A little girl, barefoot. Thin. Her hair was tangled and blonde, clinging to her cheeks in the soft wind. In her arms, she held a bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. Her arms clutched it close, the way only someone protecting something precious would. And she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She just sat there, still, silent. Daniel slowed. That wasn't like him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, his assistant reminding him about the meeting. He didn't answer. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He stopped walking. The girl turned her face slightly toward him. Her eyes were wide, clear, and far too tired for someone her age. She looked at him, not with fear, not with hope, but with something heavier. Resignation. Daniel crouched down slowly, careful not to scare her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you lost?" She shook her head. "We're not lost," she whispered. "My sister needs milk." "Mommy's in a coma." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel blinked. "Your sister?" She shifted the bundle, revealing a baby no more than a few months old. Pale cheeks, closed eyes, tiny fingers poking out from the blanket. The baby didn't stir. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated. "Sophie, and this is Olivia." Daniel looked around. People bustled in and out of the hospital entrance. Doctors, nurses, patients, but no one stopped. No one noticed. "Where's your father?" he asked. "He left when I was little," she said simply. "Then Mommy had Olivia. She got hurt in the crash. They took us to a place, but they didn't take care of Olivia. They just left her in a room, so I waited, then I took her." Her voice didn't tremble. Not until the very end. Then just slightly. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not pity. Something else deeper, more personal. He stood, pulled out his phone, and called his assistant. "Cancel the meeting," he said quietly. "Something's come up." When he looked back down, Sophie was watching him, unsure. Ready to run? He held out his hand, palm open. "Let's go inside," he said, "just to get your sister warm and fed." "You can hold her the whole time. I promise." She stared at him for a long moment, measuring his words the way adults sometimes do. Then, slowly, she stood. She never let go of Olivia. Daniel opened the hospital door and held it for her. Together, they walked in. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter wasn't walking toward a goal or away from a problem. He was walking into something unknown. And for once, he didn't want to turn back. Inside the warm lobby of Riverside Medical Center, the bustle of hospital life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Phones rang at the reception desk, a patient was wheeled past by a nurse, and someone behind Daniel called for a doctor in a firm, anxious voice. But for him, time seemed to slow. He guided Sophie toward a quiet waiting area, tucked away behind the main corridor. It was a space with soft lighting and overstuffed chairs no one ever used. A place forgotten by the efficiency of hospital design, but now it felt like a refuge. Sophie sat down cautiously, still clutching baby Olivia to her chest. She said nothing. Her small body leaned forward, as if trying to make herself invisible. The baby in her arms remained still, far too still. Daniel crouched in front of her again, lowering himself to her eye level. "Do you want me to find a nurse?" he asked gently. "Someone who can help your sister feel better?" Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Will they take her away?" "No," he said firmly. "Not unless you want them to. You can stay with her the whole time." "I promise." She didn't answer, but her grip on Olivia tightened. Daniel stood up and stepped away, pulling out his phone again. But this time it wasn't for a business call. It wasn't to check stock prices or delegate a task. He called someone he hadn't spoken to in months, a pediatrician named Dr. Evelyn Hale, who had worked with one of his foundation's outreach programs. When she answered, he spoke with a tone unfamiliar even to him. "I need someone I trust," he said. "It's urgent." "Can you come now?" Dr. Hale didn't ask for details. She simply said, "I'm on my way." Minutes later, a nurse arrived, sent by the pediatric unit, with quiet instructions from Dr. Hale. She approached the waiting area with calm eyes and gentle movements, crouching beside Sophie and offering a small smile. "You can hold her the whole time, sweetheart," the nurse said softly. "I'm just here to check her breathing and make sure she's okay." Sophie hesitated, torn between instinct and fear. But then she nodded, just once, and let the nurse touch the baby's cheek. Daniel stood at a distance, watching. He wasn't used to watching. He was used to controlling, directing, executing. But here, he stood quietly, unsure of his place, but unable to walk away. Dr. Hale arrived within half an hour, her coat still damp from the rain. She greeted Daniel briefly before kneeling beside the baby. Olivia was pale, underfed, and unresponsive, but she was breathing. Her heart was steady, if faint. "She needs formula, warmth, and rest," Dr. Hale said, standing beside Daniel as the baby was gently examined. "But she's hanging in there." "And this girl, Sophie? She's remarkable." Daniel said nothing. "You know what to do, Doctor," Hale added, looking up at him. "But this isn't a one-time gesture. If you're stepping into this, you have to really show up." Daniel's gaze moved to Sophie, who now held a bottle the nurse had warmed. She fed Olivia slowly, carefully, her tiny hands shaking with concentration. She was still just a child herself, but she was acting like someone who had learned too early how to survive. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't know what he was doing. He had no plan. No chart, no spreadsheet to guide him through this. But he knew one thing. He couldn't leave them. He stepped over quietly and waited until Sophie had finished feeding the baby. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "Would you like to come with me? Just for tonight? Somewhere warm, somewhere safe." Sophie looked up at him. "Can I hold her the whole time?" Daniel nodded. "That's a promise." An hour later, after signing a temporary care notice and promising to return the baby for observation the next day, Daniel helped Sophie into the back seat of his car. She refused to sit in a booster seat, clinging to Olivia as if any separation might break something fragile inside her. So Daniel adjusted the seatbelt around both girls, making sure they were secure. As the car pulled away from the hospital and the city lights blurred across the windshield, Daniel sat in silence. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going back to the life he had before this moment. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. The city blurred past the windows, streaks of amber and red bouncing off the dark interior of Daniel Carter's sleek black sedan. But for once, Daniel wasn't paying attention to the skyline or the flashing notifications on his phone. He was watching the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Sophie Bennett sat upright, her small frame wrapped protectively around baby Olivia. Her thin arms formed a barrier no one dared cross. She didn't speak, didn't shift, barely blinked. Barely. The baby, bundled tightly in the pink blanket, rested quietly against her chest. Daniel had seen fear before. He'd seen desperation in business deals and watched men fold under pressure in boardrooms. But he had never seen this kind of stillness. It was the stillness of a child too tired to cry, too experienced with disappointment to trust easily. When they arrived at his high-rise building, the driver opened the door. Sophie hesitated. She looked up at the glass tower with its glinting lights and marble entryway, then looked back at Daniel. "Is this your house?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "You're safe here." She tightened her hold on Olivia. "We won't stay long," she added quickly, almost like a warning. He didn't argue. Inside, the building was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the warm overhead lights. The concierge opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel gave a subtle shake of the head. No questions. Sophie walked beside him in bare feet, her eyes scanning every corner, every doorway, every movement. They rode the elevator in silence. When they stepped into the penthouse, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The apartment was spacious, sleek, and cold. The kind of space that photographed well for magazines, but had never really been lived in. Modern furniture, chrome accents, no pictures on the walls, no warmth. Sophie stopped just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the room. She didn't step forward. Daniel could see it then, how foreign this all must feel to her, how sharp and sterile. He cleared his throat and pointed gently to the hallway. "There's a guest room," he said. "It's quiet and has a bed." Sophie didn't move. "Does it have a lock?" she asked suddenly. Daniel blinked. "On the inside?" She nodded. "Yes, it does." Only then did she take a step forward, still cradling Olivia. She followed Daniel down the hall and paused again at the guest room door. He opened it for her. It was the only room in the apartment that had a touch of softness, a queen-sized bed with a quilted comforter, a small lamp on the nightstand, and a window that overlooked the city. She walked in slowly, eyeing everything. Daniel stayed in the doorway. "You can sleep here," he said. "I'll be right down the hall." She nodded once. Then, without another word, she stepped inside and gently sat on the bed with Olivia still in her arms. Daniel closed the door softly behind her. In the kitchen, he stood for a moment, unsure what to do with his hands. He'd never had children in his home, never prepared a bottle or folded a baby blanket. His world had been made of numbers, contracts, strategy, not pacifiers and lullabies. Still, he heated some milk in a small pot and poured it into a cup. He didn't know if it was for Sophie or Olivia or maybe for himself. When he returned to the guest room, the door was cracked open. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the bed, Olivia curled in her lap. Her face was unreadable. He stepped inside slowly and held out the cup. "It's warm," he said, "if you want it." She took it but didn't drink right away. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she murmured, her eyes still on Olivia. Daniel crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "That's smart," he said. "You shouldn't. But I'm not here to hurt you, and I won't do anything without your permission." She studied him for a moment, quiet, thoughtful. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "You didn't have to." Daniel was quiet. He thought of all the meetings he had taken, all the deals he had chased. How easy it would have been to keep walking. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm glad I did." That night, Sophie didn't change clothes. She curled up on the bed, still dressed, Olivia resting on her chest. Daniel stood in the hallway just outside, listening to the quiet breathing of the baby, the soft rustle of blankets. He didn't turn on his laptop. He didn't return any emails. He didn't check the stock market. Instead, He sat alone in the living room, watching the skyline, thinking about two little girls sleeping in the room down the hall, and the way one soft voice had said, "Mommy's in a coma." And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Carter didn't feel alone. He felt responsible, and it scared him in the best possible way. Daniel Carter sat alone in his home office, surrounded by silence. The room, like the rest of his penthouse, was immaculate. Shelves lined with financial journals and leather-bound volumes, a glass desk with a glowing screen. Everything in its place, except his thoughts. The house was no longer just his. Down the hallway, two lives had entered quietly, like a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie and Olivia Bennett were asleep, curled up in the guest room. He had checked in on them an hour ago. Sophie hadn't stirred, her arms still protectively wrapped around her baby sister. Now, for the first time in decades, Daniel's focus wasn't on earnings reports or corporate takeovers. It was on answers. He opened his laptop and began typing, his fingers moving slower than usual. He wasn't navigating a merger tonight. He was searching for someone, a woman named Laura Bennett, the mother Sophie had spoken of. A woman who, according to Sophie, was in a coma after a crash. A woman who had apparently vanished from the system, taking her daughters with her into invisibility. It didn't take long for Daniel to find what he needed. His wealth had opened many doors, and one of those was access, quiet, thorough, and fast. There it was, patient, Laura Bennett, age 29. Admitted to Riverside Medical Center 2 months earlier. Severe injuries from a motor vehicle accident. No listed next of kin. Currently in a coma. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Further notes in the record described her as without family support. The name Sophie Bennett was listed as a dependent, along with Olivia, noted simply as infant. The report stated that the children had been placed in emergency foster care, but that wasn't what had happened. Because Sophie wasn't in foster care, she was here, in his home, holding her baby sister with more tenderness than some adults could manage. He scrolled further. The case file for child services was brief, shockingly brief. There was a line buried near the bottom that said, "Older child unaccounted for. Presumed runaway. No active search initiated." Daniel reread the sentence 3 times. No active search initiated. A 6-year-old child had walked out of a state-run shelter with an infant in her arms, and no one had even looked. He felt something rise in his chest, not the familiar surge of frustration from business. This was something else. Something sharper. Anger. How many people had walked past Sophie like he nearly had? How many had turned away, assuming someone else would step in? He closed the file and stood, pacing across the room. This wasn't supposed to happen. Systems were supposed to protect children. Rules, policies, protocols. He had built entire companies on the belief that structure created safety. But this system had failed. And Sophie? She had filled in the gaps with nothing but courage and instinct. He picked up the phone and dialed his assistant, Grace Whitmore, even though it was nearly midnight. She answered groggily. "I need you to find everything you can on Laura Bennett," he said. "Hospital status. Legal guardianship. Foster placement records. Quietly." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Understood. And Grace?" he added. "Yes, Mr. Carter. No one can know about the girls." "Not yet. This stays between us." She paused only a moment before responding. "I won't say a word." After ending the call, Daniel walked to the window, staring out at the vast city, glowing beneath the night sky. It looked so orderly from above, so polished, but he now saw the cracks beneath the surface. Cracks where children could disappear, where babies could go hungry, where a brave little girl could be written off with a single line in a case file. He returned to the hallway and paused outside the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and the soft glow of the nightlight spilled across the floor. Inside, Sophie slept curled in a tight ball, Olivia's tiny body nestled against her chest. The baby's breathing was soft and steady. Sophie's hand rested protectively on her sister's back, even in sleep. Daniel didn't enter. He just watched from the doorway, and in that quiet moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't let them slip through the cracks again. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would make sure they were seen, safe, and never ignored again. This wasn't charity, it was responsibility. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter wasn't measuring results in numbers. He was measuring them in heartbeats. Morning light crept gently through the tall windows of Daniel Carter's apartment, casting warm streaks across the floor. For a man who usually began his day with a black coffee and a string of conference calls, the silence felt strange, almost reverent. But it was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the quiet that comes when something fragile is being carefully held. Daniel stood outside the guest room with a tray in his hands, 2 slices of toast, and a cup of warm milk. He knocked softly. Sophie's voice came after a pause. "Come in." He pushed the door open and found her already awake, sitting upright on the bed. She hadn't moved from the position she'd fallen asleep in the night before. Olivia was tucked in her arms, still dozing, her tiny hand resting against Sophie's collarbone. The little girl's blonde hair was tangled, her eyes alert and cautious, but she didn't flinch when Daniel entered. "That's good," he thought. "That's something. I brought breakfast," he said gently, placing the tray on the nightstand. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." Sophie nodded and reached for a slice of toast with one hand, never shifting the other arm from under her sister. She took a bite, chewing slowly, methodically. "She had some of the bottle you made," Sophie said after a moment. "Didn't cry much last night." "You did a good job," Daniel replied, pulling a chair near the window. He didn't get too close. He didn't want to startle her. "You kept her safe and warm." Sophie looked at him with a mix of pride and suspicion. "I had to. They don't care in that place. They kept saying someone would come, but no one came." Her voice cracked only at the end. She looked down quickly and kissed the baby's forehead. "I'm not going back," she added quietly, "even if they find me." Daniel didn't say, "It'll be okay." He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he said what he meant. "You're not going anywhere right now. You're safe here." That seemed to calm her. She relaxed just a bit and took another bite of toast. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, like learning to walk on new legs. Daniel didn't press her with questions, but she offered bits and pieces on her own, little shards of memory that came tumbling out while she fed Olivia or stared out the window. She talked about the shelter that smelled like bleach and old food, about babies who cried all night, about how the older kids pushed her in line, and about how no one noticed when she waited by the door and slipped out with her sister. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt or take notes or try to solve the story. He just sat there, a presence. And Sophie, cautious as she was, began to let the words come. By late morning, Grace Whitmore arrived at the apartment carrying 2 large bags filled with supplies, baby formula, diapers, tiny clothes, and even a few toys. Sophie tensed when she saw her, shrinking slightly behind the kitchen table. But Grace, ever intuitive, smiled warmly and held up a soft pink sweater. "I thought you might like this one," she said, offering it without stepping closer. Sophie took the sweater without speaking. She didn't put it on, but she held it in her lap the rest of the afternoon. Trust, Daniel realized, was going to be earned inch by inch. Later that day, Dr. Evelyn Hales stopped by to check on Olivia. Sophie didn't want to let the baby go, so the doctor worked around her, gently listening to Olivia's breathing and checking her reflexes while still in Sophie's arms. "She's underweight, but responsive, Doctor Hale said quietly to Daniel in the hallway. But it's the one holding her that amazes me. Daniel followed her gaze back to the guest room. Sophie was brushing Olivia's hair aside while the baby slept on her chest, bottle empty at her side. That night during dinner, Sophie ate half a bowl of soup and watched Daniel across the table, studying him. Finally, she asked, "What do you do? Are you rich or something?" Daniel blinked. It was such a simple question, but it caught him off guard. "I run a big company," he said slowly. "I used to think that mattered most." She frowned slightly, her eyes flicking to Olivia, then back to him. "And now?" He looked at her and smiled softly, genuinely. "Now I'm not so sure." Sophie didn't say anything. She just went back to eating, but her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, as if a piece of armor had been set down just for a moment. Daniel watched her and knew. The process had begun. She wasn't healed. She wasn't whole. But she was starting to believe that maybe she didn't have to do it all alone anymore. The next morning, rain streaked down the tall windows of Daniel Carter's apartment, softening the edges of the skyline and turning the city into a blur of muted grey. But inside, something warmer had begun to settle. Daniel moved quietly through the kitchen, sterilizing bottles, warming formula, and lining up a neat row of baby items on the counter. The scene was so foreign to him that he almost laughed. A week ago, he wouldn't have been able to identify a bottle warmer if it was handed to him. Now, he was checking temperatures on the back of his wrist like it was second nature. He glanced toward the hallway, where he knew Sophie was likely awake. She had the habits of a child who didn't sleep deeply, always alert, always ready. He found her standing in front of the window in the guest room, her forehead pressed lightly against the cool glass. "She's still sleeping," Sophie said softly, without turning around. "She had a good night." Daniel stepped inside and placed the warm bottle on the nightstand. "That's because you've been doing everything right," he said. Sophie turned to face him, her eyes a little softer than before. "Do you think my mom will wake up?" she asked, her voice small but steady. The question landed heavily in the room. Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, not too close, not trying to force comfort. "I hope so," he said honestly. "The doctors are doing everything they can." Sophie nodded slowly. "She used to sing to Olivia every night," she said, her voice catching. "Even if she was tired, even when we only had toast for dinner, she'd still sing." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened. Each piece Sophie shared was more than just a story. It was a memory threaded with love. Proof that Laura Bennett hadn't been neglectful or careless. She had been present, fighting for her daughters in every way she could, until the world knocked her down. Later that morning, Grace arrived with another armful of supplies, tiny diapers, gentle baby shampoo, soft blankets, and a new crib. Sophie watched quietly from the hallway as Daniel and Grace assembled the crib together. "You sure you know how to use a screwdriver, Mr. Carter?" Grace teased, handing him the tiny tool. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I run multi-billion-dollar operations, Grace. I think I can handle crib assembly." Grace smirked. "We'll see." Sophie, despite herself, smiled faintly. She didn't step in, but she stood nearby watching every movement, Olivia still wrapped snugly in her arms. When the crib was finished, Daniel stepped back and dusted off his hands. "Looks sturdy." Sophie finally approached and looked inside. "It's pretty," she said softly. Then, after a long pause, she added, "She's never had anything new before." Daniel looked at her and said gently, "She does now." That afternoon, Dr. Evelyn Hale stopped by for another checkup. This time, Sophie didn't hesitate. She let the doctor hold Olivia, stepping back just enough to give her space but not too far. "She's gaining weight, doctor," Hale noted. "Color's better too. Her sister's care is making all the difference." Sophie didn't respond, but she stood taller. Later that evening, as Daniel cleaned up dinner dishes, he found Sophie lingering in the doorway of the kitchen. Is all that stuff really for us? She asked, nodding toward the baby bottles and the stack of soft towels. Daniel nodded. Yes, just in case you need it. Sophie bit her lip, thinking. They never had that stuff where we were. I had to make bottles with cold water. Sometimes it wasn't even clean. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't try to explain it away. He simply met her eyes and nodded again. You'll never have to do that again, he said quietly. That night, Sophie and Olivia slept in the newly assembled crib and bed setup. Olivia curled under a soft pink blanket, Sophie beside her with one hand resting lightly on her sister's chest. Before heading to bed himself, Daniel peeked into the room. He watched them for a long moment, the sight of those two small figures more grounding than anything he'd ever seen. This wasn't charity. It wasn't obligation. It was care-real, honest care. And as he turned out the light, Daniel realized that for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or quarterly projections. He was thinking about bedtime bottles, lullabies, and the quiet bravery of a 6-year-old girl who had started to believe she could trust again. By the 5th day, the apartment had started to feel different, not physically. Daniel Carter's penthouse still gleamed with its modern furnishings and cold lighting. But something had shifted in the way the space held its silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet Daniel had grown used to, strategic, sterile, productive. Now, it was the quiet of presence. Sophie moved through the rooms like she had always been there, not carelessly, but with growing comfort. She carried Olivia with practiced ease, adjusting her blanket, feeding her from the warmed bottles Daniel prepared without prompting. She never let Olivia out of her reach, but her steps were more confident, less defensive. Daniel noticed everything. The way she poured her own milk in the morning, the way she folded Rose's tiny clothes and stacked them carefully in drawers, the way she straightened the corner of the rug when no one was looking. That morning, while rain tapped softly against the windows, Daniel sat at the dining table with a mug of coffee, reading over documents Evelyn Sloane had sent regarding temporary guardianship. He glanced up as Sophie wandered in, barefoot, her blanket still draped over her shoulders, a sleepy Olivia held close. She slid into the chair across from him and reached for a piece of toast without a word. Daniel smiled, then said casually, "Did Rose sleep okay?" Sophie nodded. "She had a little cough last night. But it stopped. I'll let Dr. Hale know when she visits this afternoon." Sophie took a bite of toast, chewed slowly, then looked up at him. "You're not like the people in the office." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You don't wear your watch anymore," she said. He glanced at his wristband. The silver timepiece he had worn every day for the last 20 years had been sitting untouched on his desk for nearly a week. "I guess I lost track of time," he replied, a small smile tugging at his mouth. Sophie gave the faintest smile in return. Later that morning, Dr. Hale came by for Olivia's checkup. Sophie allowed her to do a full examination this time, no hesitation, no need for Daniel to reassure her. She even stepped back a bit while the doctor worked, watching carefully but not hovering. "She's growing stronger," Dr. Hale said afterward in the living room, "and Sophie is the reason why." Daniel glanced toward the hallway, where Sophie was feeding Olivia. "I think she's teaching me a thing or two." That evening, after dinner, Sophie wandered into Daniel's home office, where he was going through a few late emails. She lingered in the doorway. "Is it okay if I come in?" He set the laptop aside and nodded. "Of course." She stepped in and looked around. "This is where you work?" "Usually," Daniel said. "Not so much lately." Sophie walked over to the desk and picked up a framed photo that had long been tucked in the corner. Daniel shaking hands with a foreign prime minister, smiles frozen, suits perfect. "You look different," she said. "Tired?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "I was tired, but I didn't know it." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she looked up. "Do you like being rich?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question. "That's complicated," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought it was the only thing that mattered, that if I had more, I could protect myself. Keep things under control." "And now?" Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. "Now I'm learning there are more important things." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "Are you going to make us leave someday?" The words hit like a stone. He stood slowly, walked around the desk, and crouched beside her. "No, you're safe here. You don't have to worry about that." She studied his face for a long moment, as if measuring whether she believed him. Then quietly she said, "They told me at the shelter that families break. That's just what happens." Daniel's voice was quiet. "Sometimes they do. But sometimes they come back together in ways you don't expect." Sophie didn't respond. But later that night, as Daniel turned out the lights, he found something on his desk. A drawing. A tall building with warm yellow windows, a small girl holding a baby, a man standing beside them. At the top, in careful block letters, she had written, "We're not alone now." Daniel sat for a long time, the drawing resting in his lap, his eyes stinging in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a contract, but it might have been the most important document he'd ever been given. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the apartment, painting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The usual hum of city traffic far below was muffled by the thick windows, leaving only the quiet sounds of a home, slowly waking up soft baby sighs, the click of cabinet doors, and the scent of oatmeal drifting from the kitchen. Daniel Carter sat at the kitchen table, reviewing a stack of neatly arranged documents spread before him. This wasn't business as usual. There were no financial projections or market forecasts. Today, the papers in front of him held a different kind of weight. They were for temporary guardianship. Evelyn Sloan, his longtime legal advisor, sat across from him. Her tone was professional, but her eyes were gentle. "This will give you legal standing to care for both Sophie and Olivia," she said. "It's temporary for now, but it sets the groundwork for long-term custody, should you want that." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I do." Evelyn handed him a pen. "Then let's begin." Before he signed, Daniel glanced toward the hallway. From the guest room, he could hear Sophie humming softly, something like a lullaby, though a little off-key. Olivia's cooing followed, light and content. He looked back down and began to sign, one document after another, each signature crisp, deliberate. Not as a businessman, but as a man making a promise. When he finished, Evelyn stacked the papers and placed them into her briefcase. "We'll submit everything this afternoon. You'll get confirmation from Family Services within a few days." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Just then, Sophie appeared in the doorway, holding Olivia on her hip. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and one of Grace's sweaters hung slightly off her shoulder. She looked more like a big sister now than a child lost in fear. She tilted her head toward the table. "What were you signing?" Daniel smiled. "Papers to make sure no one can take you or Olivia away without talking to me first." Sophie blinked, absorbing his words. "So, you'd be like our guardian?" "Yes," Daniel replied, standing up. "That's exactly what it means." She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't run into his arms. Instead, she walked over quietly, placed Olivia in her crib, and then turned to him and hugged him. Not tightly, not dramatically, just intentionally. Like a statement. And that was more than enough. Later that afternoon, the apartment was quiet. Evelyn had left, and Grace had returned with more baby formula and a few small toys. Sophie sat on the living room floor with a coloring book, drawing quietly while Olivia slept nearby. Daniel, seated in his armchair, watched the girls without saying a word.
Eventually, Sophie looked up. "You didn't ask what happened," she said, her voice soft. Daniel tilted his head.
"What do you mean?" "When we first got here. Most people ask, but you didn't. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Sophie nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer. "They told me at the shelter that families break," she added after a pause, "but maybe they don't always stay broken." Daniel met her gaze. "No. Sometimes someone shows up when you don't expect them, and they help put the pieces back together." She didn't smile right away, but her eyes held something new: recognition, understanding. The beginning of belief. As the sun began to dip behind the skyline, painting the apartment in warm amber, Sophie walked over to Daniel's desk and placed a new drawing beside the previous one. It showed a man holding a little girl's hand while she carried a baby in her arms. Above them was a sign that said home. In blocky handwriting, she had written, "I think we belong here." Daniel stood still for a long time, staring at the picture. He had signed dozens of contracts in his life. Some had been worth millions. Others had shaped industries, but none of them had ever meant as much as that single drawing. The 7th morning in Daniel Carter's apartment arrived gently, the sky outside painted with soft clouds and pale blue light. A week ago, Daniel would have begun his day with 3 back-to-back calls and a black coffee consumed standing up. Today, he stood at the stove, slowly stirring oatmeal and watching Sophie cradle Olivia at the dining table. The girl moved with quiet confidence now, pouring her own juice, folding baby blankets without being asked, humming softly as she fed her sister. These weren't acts of play, they were acts of care, deeply rooted, shaped by necessity. But in the calmness of this home, they had started to look like routine, not survival. Daniel glanced at his phone and saw the notification. A message from the hospital. He opened it and stood still. Madison Bennett had opened her eyes. According to the nurse's report, she had stirred during the night, blinking, attempting to mouth words, and had responded faintly to verbal stimuli. It was the first genuine sign of consciousness since the accident. Daniel's breath caught. He stared at the screen for several long seconds, then quietly walked over to the table. Sophie was wiping Olivia's mouth with the edge of her sleeve. She looked up at him curiously. He crouched to her level. "Sophie," he said softly, "I just got a message from the hospital." Her expression froze. "Your mom, she's starting to wake up." The words hung in the air. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Olivia cooed quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel continued gently. She opened her eyes. "They think it's the beginning. Would you like to go see her?" Sophie stared at him, then at Olivia. "Can she come with us?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Absolutely. I already promised." Less than an hour later, Daniel's car glided through the quiet streets under a silver sky. In the back seat, Sophie held Olivia close, her arms wrapped tightly around the baby. She stared out the window, her eyes fixed on something invisible in the distance, hope maybe, or fear. Daniel said little during the drive. He didn't want to push, but his hand stayed steady on the wheel, and when they arrived at Riverside Medical Center, he made sure to walk beside her, never ahead. Inside, a nurse met them with a calm, warm expression and guided them through the corridors toward the intensive care unit. As they approached the room, Sophie's steps slowed. She stopped just outside the glass panel, gripping Olivia a little tighter. Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Inside the room, Laura Bennett lay in the hospital bed. Frail, pale, tubes at her mouth and wires tracing her chest, but her eyes were half open, blinking, alive. Sophie stepped forward slowly, each step careful and deliberate. She entered the room without Daniel, who stayed just outside the doorway, his arms crossed gently in front of him, giving her space. Sophie stood by her mother's bedside for several minutes in silence. Then she reached out and placed her hand over Laura's. "I didn't leave her, Mom," she whispered. "I kept her safe." Laura's eyelids fluttered, and her lips moved slightly. No words came, but something lit in her gaze. Recognition, connection. Sophie leaned closer, her voice trembling now but still strong. "We hid. I fed her. I kept singing to her just like you used to." "And then someone helped us." She paused. "His name is Daniel," she said softly. "He didn't ask questions. He just helped." Laura's fingers shifted slightly beneath Sophie's. It wasn't much, but it was everything. When Sophie finally stepped back into the hallway, her face was flushed and damp with quiet tears. She didn't sob. She simply looked up at Daniel and said, "She knew me." "I think she did." Daniel nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "That matters," he said. Later, they sat in the hospital cafe. Olivia slept in a carrier between them, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Daniel sipped his tea while Sophie picked at a muffin, her thoughts far away. After a while, she spoke. "If she gets better, I think she'll need help too, like me." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. This child had carried the weight of survival on her back for far too long. She wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking of her mother too. "You won't have to carry it alone anymore," he said, placing his hand gently on top of hers. "Whatever happens next, I'm here." She didn't reply, but her small fingers curled over his knuckles. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic music or embrace, just a simple, quiet, grip solid, and real. That evening, back at the apartment, Sophie placed another drawing on Daniel's desk. This one showed a hospital bed, a girl holding a baby, and a man with his hand on her shoulder. Above it, in careful handwriting, were 4 words: "We're not alone anymore." Daniel stared at the picture long after she had gone to bed. And for the first time in his life, he understood what those words truly meant. The days that followed Madison's awakening were filled with cautious steps and tender moments, some too quiet to notice unless you were paying attention. And Daniel Carter had learned to pay attention. Every morning, he waited for the hospital updates. Each afternoon, he took Sophie and Olivia to visit Madison. And each evening, he returned home with the girls, never letting a day pass without showing up. Madison was still weak. Her speech came in whispers, and her hands trembled when she tried to hold a cup. But her eyes were clear, and her focus never strayed far from Sophie and Olivia. She would watch as Sophie sat beside the hospital bed, recounting stories about the apartment, the meals Daniel cooked or tried to cook, and the lullabies she'd sung when no one else was there. Daniel remained in the background, never intruding, but always present. One afternoon, as he helped Sophie color a picture for her mom in the hospital cafeteria, Madison's social worker stopped by. She carried a clipboard and an unreadable expression. After a brief introduction, she sat across from Daniel and asked softly, "Are you the one who's been caring for the girls?" "Yes," Daniel replied without hesitation. The woman nodded, reviewing a few notes. "And you're not a relative?" "No," he said, "but I'm not a stranger anymore either." Madison, overhearing the conversation later that day, looked at the social worker with a surprising steadiness in her voice. "If something happens to me again," she said, "I want him there. The girls, they already trust him." The words landed hard and deep. Daniel didn't say much. He didn't need to. Instead, he took the paper the social worker placed before him and signed it, not as a business transaction, but as a commitment. Back at the apartment, things began to change in subtle, meaningful ways. The guest room, once Sophie's safe haven, now belonged to both girls. A new crib had been placed near the bed. Diapers and tiny clothes filled a dresser. Olivia began giggling every time Daniel picked her up, clutching his tie or tugging gently at his sleeve. Sophie had started school again. On her first day, Daniel walked her to the gate himself. He wasn't sure who looked more nervous, her or him, but when she turned and waved before walking in, he felt something shift in his chest. That evening, while folding baby blankets, Madison spoke to Daniel over the phone. "I never thought this would be my life," she said. "I never imagined waking up and seeing my children already thriving without me." "You were never really gone," Daniel replied. "You were just delayed." There was silence, then the faint sound of her laugh, thin but real. They didn't define what they were. There were no labels, no plans. Madison stayed at the apartment, often sometimes for dinner, sometimes overnight in the second guest room. They took turns holding Olivia, helping Sophie with homework, or preparing simple meals that inevitably became family dinners around the kitchen table. Grace, Daniel's assistant, placed a photo of the girls in the front of her planner without being asked. Evelyn, the lawyer, stopped calling the situation a case and started calling it a home. One night, as Daniel tucked Sophie into bed, she looked at him seriously and asked, "Are you going to be my dad forever?" He didn't answer right away. He brushed a curl from her forehead and said, "Do you want me to be?" Sophie nodded. "You already are." Daniel leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then I will be." That night, standing by the large living room window, Daniel looked out at the city lights. His reflection in the glass had changed. He wasn't just older, he was fuller. Softer, in the best sense of the word. He had spent decades building an empire, towers, titles, a name people respected. But none of that had prepared him for the way Olivia laughed when she saw his face, or the way Sophie looked at him when she handed him another drawing with 3 figures under the word family. He had once believed legacy was about what you left behind. Now he understood legacy is about what you stay for. Spring came gently to the city, with longer days, softer light, and blossoms bursting from trees like small, quiet declarations of new beginnings. For Madison Bennett, every sunrise now felt like a second chance. Her recovery hadn't been easy. Physical therapy sessions left her exhausted, and some days her speech still faltered. But she was awake, aware, and back in the lives of her daughters, and that, to her, was a miracle. She spent more and more time at Daniel Carter's apartment, first as a visitor, then as something more. Some nights, she'd stay in the guest room and wake early to find Sophie already dressed, brushing Olivia's fine baby hair into tiny wisps with a patience no child should have had to learn. Other mornings, she'd find Daniel in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, attempting scrambled eggs, while Olivia babbled in her high chair. It was imperfect, but it worked. And in those small, unrushed moments, mismatched coffee mugs, shared laundry duty, quiet bedtime stories, a new kind of family began to form. Not built on tradition or perfection, but on trust, on effort, on choice. One afternoon, after a long walk in the nearby park, with both girls bundled in the stroller, Madison sat on the apartment balcony with Daniel, a blanket around her shoulders and a glass of iced tea in her hand. "Do you ever think about how strange this is?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. "Which part?" "All of it," she said, smiling faintly. "Me? Here? The girls sleeping down the hall, you boiling bottle nipples like it's second nature." Daniel chuckled softly. "Honestly, it feels less strange every day." She nodded, looking out across the city skyline. Her voice dropped. "I used to worry constantly about how I'd keep food on the table, how I'd raise 2 girls on my own. Then I'd tell myself I didn't need anyone else. That accepting help meant failure." She turned to face him. "But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being left." Again. Daniel didn't respond right away. Then he said, "You're not alone anymore, and I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. Maybe not all at once, but over the next several weeks, his words proved true. They began to share responsibilities in a way neither of them had expected. Daniel scheduled Olivia's pediatric appointments and made sure Sophie had everything she needed for school. Madison took over bedtime routines and reintroduced family dinners with home-cooked meals that made the penthouse smell like something real, something lived in. Evenings were filled with soft music, spilled juice, and coloring books on the floor. On weekends, they took turns waking up early with Olivia. Whoever rose later would find a warm cup of coffee waiting and a smiling child who knew, without question, that she was loved. One Sunday morning, while folding laundry together, Madison glanced over at Daniel. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He looked up. "I think about it all the time. And I want it to include this," he said. "Not because it's easy, but because it matters." She didn't answer, but her eyes shimmered. That afternoon, they sat with Evelyn Sloan to finalize the paperwork. Daniel would retain guardianship, but now, so would Madison. Legally and emotionally, they would co-parent, whatever that might look like. Not married. Not defined by traditional rules, just present, committed. Sophie watched from across the room, drawing quietly at the coffee table. When they were done signing, she looked up. "Is this so we don't have to move again?" she asked. Madison nodded. "It's so you always know where home is." Sophie considered that, then smiled, wide and unguarded. That evening, as Daniel placed Olivia in her crib, he paused to watch the baby sleep. Her breathing was even, her tiny hands curled gently at her sides. He stepped into the hallway and saw Madison standing at the doorway to Sophie's room, listening as the little girl read softly from a picture book. They shared a glance across the hallway. Not romantic, not forced, just understanding. They didn't need to say it aloud. They were raising these girls together, and it was enough. There was no grand announcement, no confetti, no big turning point. Just life quiet, steady, and full of small, meaningful routines. That was how their new family began to take shape. Each morning, Daniel would wake before sunrise, often to the sound of little feet padding down the hallway or Olivia's soft babble echoing from the nursery. He brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, often finding Sophie already sitting at the table, brushing out her hair and asking what the weather would be like for school. Madison usually joined them a few minutes later, tying her robe at the waist, her steps a little stronger each day. She took her tea with honey now, and always kissed the top of Olivia's head first thing, even if the baby was mid-cry or mid-spoonful. Their life wasn't perfect. And it wasn't meant to be. Some mornings were chaotic spilled cereal, mismatched socks, misplaced homework. There were days when Madison's strength faltered, or when Olivia refused to nap, when Daniel found himself behind on work, wondering how he'd ever managed billion-dollar deals, but couldn't find a missing pacifier. But somehow they figured it out. They were learning each other. Not just how to live together, but how to care actively, quietly, every day. Grace, Daniel's longtime assistant, started stopping by once a week just to visit the girls, often bringing a new storybook or soft-stuffed animal. Evelyn, the lawyer who had once spoken only in legalese, now sent handwritten notes asking about Sophie's drawings. And Sophie, for her part, had blossomed. She returned to school with a backpack that actually zipped all the way, a lunchbox she decorated herself, and a growing list of favorite words. She brought home library books and practiced reading to Olivia, whose round eyes followed her every page. One Friday afternoon, Daniel picked Sophie up from school. As they walked toward the car, she said, "My teacher asked who picks me up." Daniel looked down at her, curious. "And what did you say?" Sophie grinned. "I said, my family." That night, while folding laundry, Madison looked at Daniel with a familiar smile. "They're growing fast," she said. Daniel nodded. "Faster than I expected." She paused, then said softly, "I never imagined this would be my life. But I don't think I want it any other way." Daniel smiled. Neither do I. They didn't need big declarations. Every day had already become one. On weekends, they began doing little things together, grocery runs that turned into shared ice cream cones, walks through the park where Olivia squealed at ducks, and Sunday mornings with pancakes slightly too crispy on one side, always flipped by Daniel with exaggerated flair. One night, as Daniel tucked Sophie in, she handed him another drawing. It was simple, a picture of their apartment building, windows glowing yellow, with stick figures standing in the window, Sophie, Olivia in Madison's arms, and Daniel next to them, holding Sophie's hand. At the bottom, she had written, "Home, finally." Daniel didn't say anything. He simply knelt beside the bed and hugged her tightly. Later that night, standing alone at the living room window, Daniel stared at the lights of the city. He had once thought purpose meant building something impressive, structures, power, wealth. Now he realized it could also mean packing school lunches, warming bottles, or listening patiently to a 6-year-old explain the difference between pink and sparkle pink. His life hadn't become smaller. It had become real, and for the first time, it didn't feel like he was waiting for something more. He was already living it. The apartment was quiet that evening, but not the kind of quiet Daniel Carter used to know. It wasn't empty or cold. It was soft, peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes after bedtime stories and gentle lullabies, after tiny feet have stopped moving and the last light has been turned off. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, rinsing a baby bottle under warm water, letting his hands move slowly, mindlessly. In the background, Madison was humming from the guest room, Olivia's room now. Sophie had fallen asleep hours earlier, curled up with her favorite blanket and a book still open on her chest. The day had been like so many others lately, normal in all the best ways. They had gone to the park, shared grilled cheese sandwiches at the corner cafe, and come home with grass stains on Sophie's jeans and drool on Daniel's shoulder. It had been a good day. He set the bottle to dry and walked to the window, leaning on the frame as he looked out across the city. The skyline hadn't changed, but he had. He thought about where he was just a few months ago, measured, efficient, alone. A man who built towers of glass and steel but had no one to call when he got home. A man who could speak at global conferences but hadn't heard a child's laugh echo through his apartment in years, maybe ever. Now those things didn't matter the same way. He didn't need to be admired. He needed to be present. And he had stayed, not out of obligation or pity, but because something real had taken root. Something that didn't require a strategy or a schedule. It simply needed time. And care. Behind him, he heard Madison's footsteps as she joined him by the window. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, her shoulder gently brushing his. "She went down easy tonight," she said softly. "Didn't even fuss." Daniel smiled. "That's because she spent the afternoon chewing on my tie." They both chuckled, the kind of easy laugh shared by people who understood what it meant to be tired in the best way. Madison looked out at the skyline for a moment, then turned to him. "I never got to say it properly," she said. "Thank you, for being there, for not walking away." "You don't have to thank me," Daniel replied, voice steady. "I didn't save anyone, I just stayed." Madison nodded. "That's exactly why it mattered." They stood there in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Eventually she said, "So what now? What do we call this?" Daniel turned to her with a gentle smile. "Whatever we want. It doesn't need a label. We're raising 2 girls. We're building a life. That's enough." Later that week, something happened that Daniel hadn't expected, but would never forget. He was picking up Sophie from school when her teacher pulled him aside. "We're doing a family project," she said. "Each child is drawing their home, and who's in it." Sophie finished hers early. She handed him the paper. It was a picture of their apartment building again. Windows glowing, a warm yellow sun in the sky. But this time, there were 4 figures. Madison holding Olivia, Sophie smiling wide, and Daniel arms open, standing at the door. Above them, in large, confident letters, she had written, "This is my forever family." Daniel stared at the drawing for a long time. That night, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at him with her usual seriousness. "You're staying, right?" He brushed her hair back gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I picked you." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat and kissed her forehead. "And I picked you too." After she drifted off, he walked into the nursery where Olivia was already asleep. He stood beside the crib for a while, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. Then he turned off the light, not with hesitation, but with peace. He had spent his whole life chasing purpose, in corner offices, on private jets, through numbers and awards. But it had found him in the quiet strength of a little girl sitting outside a hospital, holding her baby sister and asking for nothing but a little kindness. And he had answered not with words, but with presence, with staying. And in that choice, he had built something no business ever could. A home, a future, a family. This story reminds us that sometimes the most meaningful changes in life don't come from grand gestures, but from quiet choices to stay, to care, and to show up. Daniel Carter began as a man who believed in results and control, but when he paused for a little girl on the hospital steps, his life shifted. Not because he planned it, but because he let himself feel. For older adults who have lived through decades of responsibilities and expectations, this story speaks to a deeper truth. It's never too late to open your heart, to begin again. To build family not from blood, but from love, presence, and everyday actions. Whether it's being there for someone, listening without judgment, or simply not walking away, these moments create the foundation of real connection. The lesson is simple but powerful. You don't have to fix everything to matter. You just have to stay. And for anyone who has questioned their place or purpose later in life, this story is a quiet encouragement that healing, family, and meaning can still be found sometimes in the most unexpected places.